They called him Crazy Erik behind his back. The Swedish immigrant who spent 3 weeks of precious autumn, time he should have been using to stockpile firewood and salt meat, digging trenches beneath his cabin floor. Trenches that served no purpose anyone could understand. Trenches that filled with clay pipes laid in patterns that looked like the scribblings of a madman. Erik Lindqvist heard the whispers. He knew his neighbors thought he'd lost his mind, but he also knew something they didn't, something his grandfather had taught him in the old country, in a longhouse on the Swedish coast where winters could kill a man in hours, but never touched those who understood the old ways. If you're watching this video and wondering how a system designed over 1,000 years ago is still more efficient than most modern heating methods, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the engineering you're about to see will change the way you think about staying warm. Erik had arrived in Minnesota in the spring of 1892. He was 28 years old, newly married to Anna Carlson from the neighboring village, and filled with the same dream that had driven millions of Europeans across the Atlantic. Land of their own, a future they could build with their own hands. The reality of Minnesota was harsher than any dream. The summer was short and brutal, filled with mosquitoes that could drain a man dry and humidity that made every task feel like swimming through wool. The autumn was deceptively beautiful, brilliant colors that masked the coming danger. And the winter, Erik's first Minnesota winter, nearly killed them. The cabin they'd built was solid enough by local standards, good logs, well chinked, with a stone fireplace that Anna kept fed day and night. They had plenty of firewood, plenty of food, plenty of blankets. They had everything their neighbors had, everything the guidebook said they needed. And still, the cold found its way in. It crept through the floor, rising up through the packed earth and the thin wooden boards Erik had laid over it. It seeped through the walls, finding every tiny gap in the chinking. It pressed against the windows like a living thing, turning Anna's breath to ice crystals that hung in the air. By February, they were burning wood faster than Erik had thought possible. The fire roared day and night, and still the floor was so cold that Anna had taken to wearing 3 pairs of socks and never taking off her boots, even to sleep. "We need more firewood," she said one morning, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "We won't make it to spring." Erik looked at their dwindling woodpile and knew she was right. They had maybe 3 weeks of fuel left, and winter would last at least 6 more weeks. He could cut more trees, but the effort of dragging them through chest-deep snow would burn almost as many calories as the wood would provide. They were trapped, and they were slowly, steadily, losing the battle against the cold. That night, as Anna slept fitfully beneath every blanket they owned, Erik sat by the fire and remembered his grandfather's house. Gustav Lindqvist had lived to be 93 years old. This was remarkable for any era, but especially remarkable for a man who had spent his entire life in one of the coldest regions of Sweden, a fishing village on the coast where winter storms could bury houses in snow, and the sea froze solid for months at a time. Gustav's house was old, impossibly old. The main structure had been built by his great-great-grandfather using techniques passed down from generations before that. Some said the original design came from the Viking Age, when Norsemen had learned to survive in climates that would kill lesser peoples. Erik had spent his childhood summers in that house, and he remembered one thing above all else. The floor was always warm. not warm like standing near a fire. Warm like summer stone that had been baking in the sun, warm in a way that seemed to rise up through your feet and spread through your entire body, keeping the cold at bay from the inside out. How? Young Erik had asked one winter night, sitting on that miraculous floor while a blizzard raged outside. How is the floor warm when everything else is frozen? Gustav had smiled, the knowing smile of a man sharing a secret that most of the world had forgotten. "Come," he said, "I'll show you." They went down to the cellar, a space carved out of the earth beneath the house. Gustav held up a lantern, and Erik saw something that made no sense. Clay pipes, dozens of them, running in careful patterns beneath the floor above. "The fire heats the air," Gustav explained, pointing to where the pipes connected to the back of the fireplace. "The hot air rises through these pipes and spreads beneath the floor. The floor absorbs the heat and releases it slowly, keeping the entire room warm. Not just the air near the fire, the entire room." "But the pipes—" Erik traced their path with his eyes, trying to understand the pattern. "They go everywhere." "That's the secret. The heat must be distributed evenly, or some areas will be hot while others stay cold. The pipes are laid in a specific pattern. My great-great-grandfather designed it based on patterns he'd seen in the old longhouses. They say the Vikings learned it from the Romans, who learned it from even older peoples. Knowledge that's been passed down for 1,000 years. "Why doesn't everyone do this?" Erik asked. Gustav's smile faded. "Because people forget. They move to new places, they adopt new ways, and they forget the old wisdom. Your father, my son, he thought this was superstition. Old man's nonsense, he called it. He built his house the modern way with a big stove in the middle, and every winter he burns 10 times the fuel I burn, and still his family is cold." The old man knelt down, putting his weathered hand on Erik's shoulder. "Remember this, boy. Remember what I'm showing you, because someday you might need it, and when that day comes, you'll be glad your grandfather was too stubborn to forget the old ways." Erik remembered. Sitting by the fire in his freezing Minnesota cabin, watching his wife shiver beneath every blanket they owned, he remembered every detail his grandfather had shown him. The angle of the pipes, the distance between them, the way they connected to the fireplace to capture heat that would otherwise escape up the chimney. He remembered, and he made a decision. "Anna," he shook her gently awake. "Anna, I have an idea." She opened her eyes, and he saw the exhaustion there, the beginning of despair. They were losing this fight, and she knew it. "What kind of idea?" "I'm going to fix the floor." She stared at him. "Fix the floor?" "Erik, the floor's fine. The floor isn't the problem. The floor is exactly the problem." He pulled her close, trying to warm her with what little heat his body had to spare. "My grandfather showed me something years ago, a way to heat a house that uses half the wood and keeps everything warm. Not just the air near the fire, but the whole room, the floor, the walls, everything." "Erik," Anna's voice was gentle, the way you spoke to someone who might be losing their grip on reality. "The ground is frozen solid. You can't dig trenches in frozen ground." "I can if I thaw it first, and I know exactly how to do that." Anna was silent for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, throwing ice against the cabin walls. "You really believe this will work?" "I know it will work. I've seen it work. My grandfather's house was the warmest place I've ever been, and he burned less wood than anyone in the village. Anna studied his face in the firelight. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly. Then we try. What do we have to lose? Erik kissed her forehead. Nothing. We have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The process took 3 weeks. First, Erik built a smaller fire directly on the floor in the corner he wanted to start with. He let it burn for 2 days, melting the frost in the packed earth beneath the floorboards. Then he pulled up the boards, one by one, and began to dig. The work was brutal. The earth was still cold, still resistant, and every shovelful felt like moving stone. His back screamed, his hands blistered, bled, and blistered again. But inch by inch, foot by foot, he carved trenches into the ground beneath his home. His neighbors noticed. Thomas Brennan was the first to comment, a red-haired Irishman who'd homesteaded the next claim over. He showed up on the 3rd day of digging, watching Erik work with an expression caught between curiosity and concern. "Lindqvist, what in God's name are you doing?" "Building a heating system." Erik didn't stop working. He couldn't afford to stop. Every moment the trench was exposed, it was trying to freeze solid again. "A heating system? Under your floor?" "Yes." Brennan was quiet for a moment. "You know that's not how heating works, right? Heat rises. Everyone knows that. If you want a warmer room, you need a bigger stove or a better chimney, or heat rises." Erik finally paused, leaning on his shovel. "You're right about that. But what happens to the heat after it rises?" Brennan blinked. "What do you mean?" "It goes up to the ceiling, sits there, then goes out through the roof, through every crack and gap it can find. Meanwhile, the floor stays cold, and everything you touch is freezing, and you burn wood all day and night, and still you can't get warm." Erik gestured at his trench. "This captures the heat before it escapes, spreads it out, uses it twice before it's gone." "That's—" Brennan shook his head. "That's not science. That's superstition. My grandfather lived to be 93 years old in a climate colder than this. He burned half the wood his neighbors burned and was twice as warm. That's not superstition. That's results." Brennan laughed, but there was uncertainty in it. "Well, good luck to you, Lindqvist. I'll be interested to see how this system of yours works out." He walked away, and Erik went back to digging. The clay pipes were the hardest part. Erik couldn't buy what he needed. The general store in town had never heard of such a thing, and ordering from back east would take months and cost money they didn't have. So he made them himself. He found a deposit of clay 3 miles from the cabin, at a spot where a creek bank had eroded to reveal layers of gray-brown earth perfect for his purposes. He hauled bucket after bucket of the stuff back home, mixed it with water and straw for strength, and shaped it into pipes, using a form he'd carved from a log. The pipes had to dry slowly, or they'd crack. Too fast and the outside would harden while the inside stayed wet. When the moisture finally escaped, the pipe would split apart. Erik built a drying rack near the fireplace, carefully rotating the pipes every few hours to ensure even drying. Each pipe took 3 days to dry properly. He needed over 100 of them. Anna helped when she could, but she was fighting her own battle, keeping the fire fed, cooking what little food they had left, tending to the small garden of sprouts she'd started in a box by the window. They worked in shifts, sleeping in snatches, pushing through exhaustion that went bone deep. Their neighbors watched with growing concern. "He's lost his mind," Erik heard Brennan say one day, speaking to a group of settlers gathered at the general store. Spending all his time on this pipe dream, while his woodpile gets smaller and smaller. When that runs out, he and his wife are going to freeze to death in that cabin, surrounded by clay pipes that don't do anything. Someone should talk to him, another voice said. Make him see sense. I tried. The man won't listen. He's convinced this is going to work. Well, when it doesn't, I suppose we'll have to take care of the widow. Someone will need to. Erik walked away before they could see him. He didn't have time for their doubts. He had work to do. The pipes were laid in a pattern Erik had memorized as a child, watching his grandfather draw it in the dust of the cellar floor. It wasn't random. It wasn't guesswork. It was engineering. Ancient engineering, developed over centuries by people who understood heat and airflow in ways that modern science was only beginning to rediscover. The pattern started at the fireplace, where iron fittings Erik had forged himself, connected to a gap in the back of the hearth. This gap, invisible from the front, allowed hot air from the fire to enter the pipe system instead of simply rising up the chimney. From there, the pipes branched outward in a spiral pattern, circling the room in ever-widening loops. Each loop was slightly higher than the last, following the natural tendency of hot air to rise while keeping it contained long enough to transfer its heat to the surrounding earth. The earth was the key. Clay holds heat. Packed earth holds heat even better. By running the pipes through the earth beneath the floor, Erik was creating a massive thermal battery, a reservoir of warmth that would absorb heat when the fire was roaring and release it slowly when the fire burned low. The final pieces were the vents, small gaps in the floorboards, carefully positioned, that would allow the warmed air to rise gently into the room after it had given up most of its heat to the floor itself. It's like a maze, Anna said, looking at the completed system before Erik laid the last floorboards back in place. A maze for the heat. Exactly. Erik wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. The longer the path, the more heat transfers from the air to the floor. By the time the air reaches those vents, it's already given us most of its warmth. What comes up is just the last little bit, the part that would have escaped up the chimney anyway. And the floor? The floor will be warm as my grandfather's floor on the coldest nights of the Swedish winter. Anna looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, he saw hope in her eyes. Let's find out, she said. They sealed the last floorboard at sunset on a Thursday. The temperature outside was 15 degrees below zero. The wind was blowing hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. It was, by any measure, the worst possible night to test a new heating system. It was perfect. Erik built a fire the way his grandfather had taught him, not a roaring blaze, but a steady, moderate burn that would last for hours. He added the wood slowly, maintaining a consistent temperature rather than letting the fire spike and fade. Then they waited. For the first hour, nothing seemed different. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The floor felt exactly as cold as it always had. Maybe it takes time, Anna said, but Erik could hear the doubt creeping back into her voice. It does take time. The earth has to absorb the heat first. Be patient. They waited another hour, and another. Erik added wood to the fire, maintaining the steady burn, fighting his own growing doubt. Then, around midnight, Anna gasped. Erik, the floor! She was standing in the corner farthest from the fireplace, the corner that was always coldest, the corner where they'd learned never to sit because the chill would seep into your bones." Erik walked over to her and stopped. The floor was warm, not just not cold, warm, genuinely, unmistakably warm, like sun-baked stone in summer. "Take off your boots," Erik said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna pulled off her boots, then her socks. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor in the coldest corner of the house on one of the coldest nights of the Minnesota winter. And she smiled. "It's warm," she said. "Erik, it's actually warm." Erik knelt down and pressed his palm to the floor. Heat radiated up through the wood. Gentle, even heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He moved across the room, testing different spots. The temperature varied slightly, warmer near the fireplace, cooler near the walls. But everywhere, the floor was warm. "We did it," he said. "Anna, we did it." She threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. Outside, the wind screamed and the temperature dropped, and the winter tried its best to kill everything in its path. Inside, Erik and Anna Lindqvist stood barefoot on a warm floor and knew they were going to survive. Word spread slowly at first. The Brennans were the first to notice something strange. Thomas had been watching the Lindqvist cabin, waiting for the inevitable moment when their woodpile ran out and they'd have to come begging for help. But days passed, then weeks, and the woodpile barely seemed to shrink. "They're burning less than half what we burn," Brennan told his wife one evening. "Maybe a third, and I saw Anna walking around in there with bare feet. Bare feet in January." "Maybe they're just making do," his wife suggested. "Toughing it out." "No, there's something else going on." Brennan's curiosity finally got the better of him. On a day when the temperature had briefly risen to a mere 5 below zero, he walked over to the Lindqvist cabin and knocked on the door. Erik answered, and Brennan's eyes immediately went to his feet. He was wearing light wool socks, no shoes, no boots, just socks in a Minnesota January. "Brennan, come in, it's cold out there." Brennan stepped inside and stopped dead. The heat hit him like a wave, not the sharp, focused heat of standing near a fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air was comfortable, the walls felt warm to the touch, and the floor. "May I?" Brennan gestured at his boots. "Of course." He pulled off his boots and stood on the wooden floor in his stocking feet. His mouth fell open. "It's warm," he said. "The floor is warm. The pipes." Erik couldn't hide his smile. "The pipes I spent 3 weeks installing while you told everyone I'd gone mad." "But how?" "Heat rises. Everyone knows heat rises." "Heat rises," Erik agreed, "so I gave it somewhere to rise to. The pipes carry hot air from the back of the fireplace under the entire floor, warming the earth as it goes. The earth holds the heat and releases it slowly through the floorboards. We stay warm with half the wood, and we never have cold feet." Brennan walked around the room, testing different spots on the floor. Warm, warm, warm. Even the corners, even the spots farthest from the fire. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I thought you were crazy. I told everyone you were crazy." "You weren't wrong to doubt. It seemed impossible. But sometimes the old ways are old because they work." "Can you—" Brennan hesitated. "Can you show me how you did it? My children, their feet are always so cold, and my wife has been sick for weeks, and the wood we're burning—" "Come by tomorrow," Erik said. "I'll draw you the pattern." "But Brennan—" "Yes." It's hard work. 3 weeks of the hardest work I've ever done. You'll have to dig up your entire floor and lay it again. Are you willing to do that?" Brennan looked down at his warm feet. He thought about his children, huddled near the fire with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. He thought about his wife, coughing in the cold bedroom. "I'll do whatever it takes." By the end of that winter, 5 more families had installed Erik's heating system. Thomas Brennan was the first, and his installation became the template for everyone who followed. Erik spent 3 days at the Brennan homestead, helping Thomas dig the trenches and lay the pipes, explaining every decision along the way. "The spacing matters," Erik said, standing in a trench that reached his waist. "Too close together and you waste pipes. Too far apart and you get cold spots. My grandfather said the ideal distance is about 18 inches, close enough that the heat overlaps, far enough that each pipe contributes something new." "How did he figure that out?" Thomas asked, handing down another clay pipe. "Trial and error. Generations of trial and error. His grandfather taught him, and his grandfather's grandfather taught him, all the way back to the longhouses. Each generation made it a little better, a little more efficient." "And you just remembered all of it?" Erik fitted the pipe into place, checking the angle. "I remembered what he showed me. Whether I remembered it right, we'll find out when we light the fire." They finished the installation on a Thursday night. The Brennan children, 5 of them ranging from 3 to 14, gathered to watch as Thomas lit the first fire in their newly modified fireplace. "It won't work right away," Erik warned. "The earth needs time to absorb the heat. Could be hours, could be overnight." "We've waited all winter," Thomas's wife Mary said. "We can wait a few more hours." But they didn't have to wait that long. Within 3 hours, the temperature in the cabin had risen noticeably. Within 5 hours, the children had shed their sweaters. By morning, Mary was walking barefoot on the floor, tears streaming down her face. "It's warm," she kept saying. "Thomas, the floor is warm." Thomas Brennan, who had called Erik crazy not 3 weeks before, stood in the middle of his cabin and wept with relief. His children were warm. His wife was warm. For the first time since November, he didn't feel like they were slowly losing a war against the cold. "I take back everything I said," he told Erik, "every word of it." "You were right to doubt. It did seem impossible." "No," Thomas shook his head. "I was wrong, and I was cruel about it. You didn't deserve that." Erik shrugged. "My grandfather used to say that the measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The measure is whether he admits them and tries to do better." "Your grandfather sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was, and every day I try to live up to his example." Word spread quickly after the Brennan installation. The Olsons came next, then the Johanssons, then the Petersons. Each family brought their own challenges, different cabin layouts, different soil conditions, different fireplace designs. But Erik helped them adapt the basic principles to their specific situations. It wasn't easy. The work was brutal, especially in the dead of winter, when the ground wanted to freeze solid the moment it was exposed. But word had spread about the Lindqvist miracle, the cabin where you could walk barefoot in January, where the fire burned low but the warmth never faded. Erik helped where he could, drawing patterns and explaining techniques, but most of the work had to be done by each family themselves. The pipes had to be shaped to fit each individual cabin. The trenches had to be dug based on the specific layout of each home. There was no shortcut, no way to mass-produce what he'd created. But the results spoke for themselves. The Brennan family made it through the rest of the winter, burning less than half their normal firewood. Their children stopped getting frostbite on their toes. Thomas's wife recovered from her illness within 2 weeks of the installation. The Olsons, a Swedish family who'd settled 3 miles south, were so impressed that they expanded the system to include their barn. Their livestock survived the winter with fewer losses than any year before. Old Henrik Johansson, who'd been ready to give up and head back to civilization, found his will to stay renewed when his cabin became the warmest building he had ever lived in. He built an addition the following summer, with the pipe system designed in from the start. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the ground thawed, the prairie burst into green and gold and purple, wildflowers covering the scars of winter, as if the cold had never happened at all. Erik stood outside his cabin on the first truly warm day of the year, watching Anna hang laundry on the line. She was singing, something Swedish, something her grandmother had taught her, and the sound filled him with a peace he hadn't felt in months. They had survived, more than survived, they had thrived. The pipe system had given them an advantage no amount of money could buy: warmth without waste, comfort without constant struggle. While other families had burned through their entire winter's supply of wood and then some, the Lindqvists had finished the season with wood to spare. "You look pleased with yourself," Anna said, noticing his expression. "I am pleased. We made it. We actually made it." Was there any doubt? Erik thought about the desperate nights before the installation, when he'd watched their woodpile shrink and wondered if they'd see spring. He thought about the neighbors who'd called him crazy, the work that had nearly broken him, the moment of pure terror when he'd lit the fire and waited to see if everything he'd done would amount to anything. "Yes," he said honestly, "there was doubt, but I had to try. My grandfather's voice was in my head, telling me that the old ways work, that knowledge shouldn't be forgotten just because it's old." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was, and stubborn, so stubborn." Erik smiled at the memory. "He used to say that the world is full of people who think they know better than the ones who came before. But the ones who came before, they figured things out the hard way. They tried and failed and tried again until they found what worked. To throw that away just because it's old, that's not progress. That's arrogance." Anna walked over and took his hand. "Do you think people will remember what you've built here? The pipe system?" "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe they'll call it something fancy and pretend they invented it themselves." "Would that bother you?" Erik considered the question. He thought about fame, about credit, about all the things that seemed to matter so much to some people. "No," he said finally, "it wouldn't. Because the point was never to be remembered. The point was to stay warm, to keep you warm, to keep our family warm, to survive another winter and another and another. If what I've built helps other people do the same, if it spreads to 100 families, 1,000 families, 1,000,000 families who never know my name, that's enough. That's more than enough." Anna squeezed his hand. "Your grandfather would be proud." "I hope so. I really hope so." The system Erik Lindqvist built in 1894 would later be recognized as an early example of radiant floor heating. Modern versions use copper pipes and hot water instead of clay pipes and hot air. They're installed by professionals with specialized equipment instead of desperate immigrants with hand tools and determination. They cost thousands of dollars and require complex thermostats and pumps. But the fundamental principle is exactly the same. Heat the floor, and the floor heats you. It's more efficient than forced air heating because warm air doesn't collect uselessly at the ceiling. It's more comfortable because it eliminates cold spots and keeps feet warm. It's more economical because it allows lower thermostat settings while maintaining the same level of comfort. The Romans knew this. They called it hypocaust, and they used it to heat their bathhouses and villas. The Koreans knew it. They called it ondol, and they've been using it for thousands of years. The Vikings knew it. Gustav Lindqvist knew it. And on a frozen Minnesota night in 1894, Erik Lindqvist rediscovered it out of pure desperation. Today, radiant floor heating is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Companies patent new variations of the same ancient principles. Engineers write papers about optimal pipe spacing and heat transfer coefficients. Contractors charge premium prices to install what Erik Lindqvist installed alone, by hand, with pipes he made himself from river clay. None of them know his name. None of them know that a Swedish immigrant fighting for his family's survival in a frozen cabin proved the concept works before any of them were born. But that's okay, because somewhere in Minnesota there are families descended from the Lindqvists and the Brennans and the Olsons. Families who tell stories about the winter of 1894, about the crazy immigrant who dug trenches under his floor, about the moment when their great-great-grandparents stood barefoot on warm wood while blizzards raged outside. Knowledge passes down through generations, not always in books, not always in patents. Sometimes in stories told around dinner tables, in memories that grandparents share with grandchildren, in the accumulated wisdom of people who figured things out the hard way. Gustav Lindqvist taught his grandson. Erik Lindqvist taught his neighbors. Those neighbors taught their children. And somewhere, somehow, the knowledge survived. The Lindqvist homestead stood for 97 years. Erik and Anna raised 6 children in that cabin, all of whom learned to walk on floors that never felt cold. Erik expanded the pipe system twice. Once, when they built an addition for the growing family, and once, when he added a workshop where he could work in comfort even in the depths of winter. He died in 1952 at the age of 88. Anna had passed 3 years earlier, peacefully, in the same cabin where they'd nearly frozen to death 60 years before. Their children had long since grown and scattered. 2 stayed in Minnesota, 1 moved to California, 3 went back to Sweden, but they all remembered the floors. It was the strangest thing, Erik's grandson Carl would say decades later. Walking into my grandparents' house in the middle of January and feeling warm. Not the kind of warm you get from standing next to a heater. A different kind of warm, a warm that came from everywhere at once. Did he explain how it worked? Someone would always ask. Hundreds of times he drew diagrams. He showed us the pipes. He made us understand that it wasn't magic, it was engineering. Ancient engineering that had been forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten again. Did you ever install one yourself? Carl would smile sadly. No. By the time I had my own house, they had central heating, furnaces and ductwork and all the modern conveniences. It seemed easier, simpler. I didn't want to dig up my floor. Do you regret it? A long pause. Every winter, every time I sit in my living room with cold feet, waiting for the furnace to cycle on, I remember my grandfather's floor, and I think about what I gave up for convenience. The cabin finally fell in 1991, claimed by a storm that had nothing to do with the cold. By then, Erik's pipe system had been studied by historians and engineers who wanted to understand how it worked. They took measurements, they made drawings, they wrote papers with titles like Indigenous Heating Solutions in 19th Century Minnesota and Folk Engineering and Thermal Efficiency. A professor from the University of Minnesota named Dr. Sarah Chen spent 2 summers at the site, carefully excavating and documenting everything she found. She was amazed by what she discovered. "The engineering is remarkably sophisticated," she wrote in her paper. "The pipe layout shows a clear understanding of thermal dynamics, the way heat moves through different materials, the way warm air rises and cool air sinks. Whoever designed this system knew exactly what they were doing." She never found Erik's name in any historical records. He'd never filed a patent, never written down his methods, never tried to profit from what he'd built. He'd simply solved a problem for his family and then shared the solution with his neighbors. "That's the tragedy of folk engineering, Doctor," Chen told her students. "So much knowledge exists in communities, passed down through families, but it's never documented. When the communities change or the families move away, the knowledge disappears. We have no idea how many innovations have been lost this way." She found evidence of at least 12 heating systems in the area that had been built using Erik's design. 12 families who had survived Minnesota winters with warm floors and smaller wood piles. Most of the systems had been abandoned when the cabins were modernized or replaced. A few had been destroyed by fire or storm, but one, remarkably, was still functioning. The Peterson farm had passed down through 4 generations, and the original farmhouse, expanded and modernized over the years, still stood. More importantly, the pipe system Erik had helped install in 1895 was still working. "We didn't know what it was," James Peterson told Dr. Chen when she visited. "We just knew that the old part of the house was always warmer than the additions. My grandfather used to say it was because of the floor, but we didn't understand what he meant until you showed up." Dr. Chen crawled under the house with a flashlight and found the clay pipes exactly where Erik had placed them over a century before. They were cracked in places, patched in others, but the basic system was intact. Heat from the farmhouse's modern furnace was still finding its way into the old pipes, still warming the floor the way Erik had intended. "It's a museum piece that still works," Dr. Chen said. "I've never seen anything like it." She convinced the Petersons to preserve the system rather than replace it. With a grant from the Minnesota Historical Society, she documented every detail: the pipe layout, the connection points, the vents in the floor. She created 3D models and thermal simulations. She wrote a book called Heat from Below: The Lost Engineering of the Pioneer Era. The book sold modestly at first, mostly to other academics and history buffs. But then something unexpected happened. A home renovation show featured the Peterson farmhouse, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the Swedish heating system that had kept a family warm for over 100 years. Dr. Chen's book went through 3 printings. She was interviewed on podcasts and news programs. Contractors started calling, asking if she could help them recreate the system using modern materials. But the floor itself, the original clay pipes that Erik had shaped by hand, the trenches he'd dug in frozen earth, those remained at the Peterson farm, protected now by historical preservation laws. Visitors could see them through glass panels installed in the floor, still doing the job they'd been designed to do over a century ago. Just as Gustav had predicted, the knowledge was mostly forgotten. Modern homes have modern heating. No one wants to dig trenches under their floor when you can just turn up the thermostat. But maybe, just maybe, that's starting to change. As energy costs rise and people look for more sustainable ways to heat their homes, radiant floor heating is making a comeback. The materials are different now. PEX tubing instead of clay, hot water instead of hot air. But the principle is exactly what Erik Lindqvist proved in 1894. Heat the floor. Let the floor heat the room. Use the earth itself as a battery to store and release warmth. It works. It's always worked. It was working 1,000 years ago when Vikings built their longhouses. And it will be working 1,000 years from now when our descendants figure out what we forgot. Some knowledge is too important to lose. What heating system does your home use? Have you ever considered radiant floor heating? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, because sometimes the best solutions are the ones that have been around the longest. And if you want to learn more about forgotten engineering that still works today, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got more stories coming about the innovations our ancestors figured out, and how we're only now beginning to understand how smart they really were. Until next time, stay warm from the ground up.